as the hour goes on. And so it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Stephen R. Miller. Stephen is a law professor at the University of Idaho College of Law in Boise. He's the principal investigator on a 3-year grant from the U.S. Forest Service and Idaho Department of Lands, where he's investigating and proposing the best practices for wildfire planning in the West. Along with his collaborators, he's recently published a 167-page WUI Wildfire Planning Guide, and this details the 4-step approach that he's going to be discussing today. Professor Miller holds an AB from Brown's University, a master's in urban planning from the University of California, Berkeley, and a JD from the University of California, Hastings. In addition to wildfire, Professor Miller is a prolific writer on a variety of topics in the areas of land use, sustainability, and urban environmental law. All right, and with that, thank you, Stephen, for joining us, and you have the floor.
All right, well, thank you, Stacy. Can you hear me?
I would say you might be a little bit quiet, but I mean, otherwise.
How about this? Is this better?
Much better, thank
you. Okay, great. Well, thank you for that introduction, Stacy, and thanks for having me. I am excited to give this presentation and talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing with my colleagues here in Idaho. Just a little bit about the grant team. You see it there. I was brought in, and just a little bit of a history about me and how I came to work on wildfire. The particular grant that I'm working on is not a research grant per se. It's really about trying to apply existing knowledge about wildfire and figure out ways that we can new ways that we can use existing knowledge to reduce and mitigate risks. So to that end, I openly acknowledge that I'm a law professor first, and I was brought in on this to try to think through some of the systems related to how we address wildfire, and that's really going to be kind of what I'm going to be talking about, is how we can rethink the ways and the approaches that we engage in wildfire planning to make it effective. That approach that we're going to be talking about necessarily means moving fire beyond just the fire department or the typical fire agencies that are engaged at the federal, state, and local level. And that's really going to be the heart of this 4-step approach that we're going to lay out here. Now, some of you that are listening may already be doing things similar to what we're going to talk about. And frankly, I would love to hear from you and hear about successes or failures, such as they may be, in ways that we can learn from that. But in trying to put forth this approach, we talked with both within ourselves, amongst ourselves, but we also talked with some experts that are really kind of some of the leaders in the field, and I want to just acknowledge several of those. One is Molly Mallory and the folks at Wildfire Planning International, which are doing some really interesting work on wildfire planning throughout, especially the western United States. And also Tyra Holfeldt, who's at the Idaho Department of Lands, but prior to that worked in Utah and did a lot of the groundbreaking work there on local wildfire planning. So I will admit that I have benefited greatly and learned under both of them. And we also conducted a number of interviews of people throughout, especially the western United States, to try to learn about what folks are doing that is working and where the issues are that we need to address. So after we had done all of that, our team put together the report that Stacy mentioned, and which I believe will be linked along with this webinar, and or otherwise is available online by just, if you just Google Planning for Wildfire in the Wildland-Urban Interface and my name, it'll come up. But what I want to do today is basically run through a version of that guide. Now, for those of you that may be academics out there, what I tried to do with the guide is really an applied version of what academics might call resilience theory, which is really looking at, sounds fancy, but really is just a way to think about how we adapt to changes in the environment, and specifically look at how different levels of government relate to each other and can better address those changes, especially with regard to climate change, but just other issues independent of that. So I'm going to give a truncated version of the guide, and also just a little, my anticipation is to that this is a pretty knowledgeable group. So I'm going to maybe give a little bit of running commentary in addition to going through each of these. And I welcome, as I say, I welcome your feedback on this, because what we're trying to do is to think about what the structure is that can permit us to not just fight wildfires, but to think about how we would effectively plan for existing and new developments that are going to be in the way of wildfire. So first, let's begin with the question about the risk of wildfire. Now, for those of you that are in the fire communities, you've probably seen a lot of this stuff before. So, you know, one of the ways that people think about risks of wildfire and why we should care is that it costs us money. So as folks have probably seen these numbers, in 1995, fire made up just 16% of the U.S. Forest Service annual appropriation budget, but in 2015, it was more than 50%, okay? And we know from other studies, a recent study out of Wyoming found that sometimes protecting just one house in the WUI could lead to up to $225,000 in wildfire fighting costs. So you have the overall cost issue, especially for the federal government, and then you have this sort of outsized issue of WUI wildfires. What we're trying to do, and I imagine many of you are trying to do as well, is to encourage people to think about the costs or the risk of wildfire as being more than just money. And that is a broader-based educational effort that I know the fire community has been thinking about for a long time, but we're trying to think about ways to get others, especially the planning departments and the building departments and local officials, to think about and care about that as well. So what are some of those other things that are costs or risks associated with wildfire? Well, there can be lost recreational opportunities. And here in Boise, I often will point out that we had a fire right next to downtown last summer that took out some of the most treasured hiking and biking paths in our area here. So that's one issue. Scarred landscapes, right? So the sort of aesthetic issue, which can relate to also to economic development concerns. Loss of wildlife habitat, right? That can be a major issue in terms of environmental concerns. Also a major issue, as I'm sure many of you know, presence of invasive species. And then the things that often are forgotten, especially among those not in the fire world, are the after effects of fire, flood, and landslides, maybe best memorialized in Colorado with the, from the 2013 wildfires there in the book, A September to Remember. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, I would suggest it. So why do we specifically care about this in the WUI? Well, as noted there, 6 of the 10 most expensive wildfires are WUI wildfires. And currently only about 14, probably a little bit more than this. This number is a little bit old, right? It's a 2001 number, that 14% of the WUI is currently developed. Now, subsequent data has put that a little bit in the higher teens. I still use the 14% number because it's the most cited. But point being, there's a lot of WUI out there, and especially for those of us in the Mountain West and I'll speak to our region, being one of the fastest growing in the country, we know that we are building into the WUI. And as we do that, we really need to be thinking about how we're building and calculating the risks, not just in cost of suppression, but also all these other considerations. All right. So in terms of outreach, one of the things that we are also encouraging people to do is to think about what the Wildland-Urban Interface, or WUI, is. Now, again, within the world of people that have been doing this for a while, they can say, well, I don't even need, that's such a basic question. And in fact, I was just doing a presentation to building officials here in Idaho a couple weeks ago, and a gentleman spoke up at that meeting, and he said, I was giving this part of the talk, and he said, stop it with this already. Tell me something I don't know. I know what the WUI is. Well, I'd like to just step back from that a second, and just sort of get us to think about the WUI in three different ways. And the first is, that the WUI has a policy definition, right? And you've probably seen this first definition, where humans in their development meet or intermix with wildland fuel. And there are other options for how you would think about that, and often a lot of sociologists or demographers will think about density-based models for determining what the WUI is. But as a law professor, I would also like for you to think about the WUI as being a legal concept, and a legal concept that varies not just from the policy definition, but that can vary between laws. So, for instance, in the Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003, or HEFRA, there is a categorical, sort of a background definition of the WUI. And if a community does not otherwise engage in a community wildfire protection plan definition of the WUI, this very limited version, statutory version of the WUI will rule under HEFRA. However, if you get together as the community and define your WUI, then that is the WUI for purposes of HEFRA. And so here's an example of Teton County, Idaho, where they took a very broad-based approach to defining what their WUI is in their CWPP. And that would be, if the original definition, you can see there's 3 little towns there. In the prior version of this, it was just a half mile around each of those towns. So there's a legal difference, right, depending on how you engage the process. Well, let me just show one other example of a different law that has a different legal definition of the WUI. In 2016, President Obama issued an executive order requiring federal buildings to meet certain wildfire standards as defined by the order, but it used a completely different metric for determining what the WUI was. And here, if you look at the same place, Teton County, Idaho, you'll note that it defines the WUI completely differently than they defined it, either under HEFRA as defined by the CWPP, or as they had defined it under the statutory definition. So the point being that we have a policy definition and we have a legal definition that varies between statutes and other executive orders. Third, we encourage people to recognize that the WUI is a fluid concept. So independent of whether you're looking at it as a policy definition or a legal definition, that WUI area can change as development progresses. This is especially important in fast growth areas throughout the West. And so this means that you need to have that ongoing engagement in what the WUI is to make sure that you are responding to the WUI as development continues. All right, so all of that is prefatory in a way, but we think it's important because it lays the groundwork for helping people to think about these issues. So as we talk to people around the country and as we read in the literature, we tried to lay down procedural principles for how we thought basics for planning for wildfire should proceed. And when we looked at the best and the brightest places out there that were doing really forward-looking wildfire planning, there were certain things that emerged, and we just tried to capture them. So in a sense, this is empirical. We're drawing a little bit on that resilience theory that I talked about in the past, but really this is based upon interviews of places that really seem to be doing groundbreaking work. So the first thing that places seem to have done is to find ways to engage the public and encourage public ownership of the WUI wildfire planning process. So when we talked about that sense of ownership, you know, a lot of times cities will look to their fire departments or will think about the fire apparatus generally, federal, state, and local, and think, well, those folks should own fire. But the places that seem to be doing the best wildfire planning really seem to focus on the idea of the public owning the process and the public being willing to engage it and implement it. Second, we saw people talking about encouraging different levels of government to speak with each other, and especially ways that would mobilize the public. So this often happens within the wildfire community. I think there's a good relationship between the federal, state, and local fire departments. But is that flowing over into the other development-based sections of which are often controlled, in the United States at least, at the local level? Do you have those folks engaged? Breaking silos, right? One of the things we know is that both at the federal, state, and local levels, there are different departments, right? And are people thinking across those silos? Is fire talking to planning? Is planning talking to building? Is BLM talking to the Forest Service? Trying to get everybody in the room who might have a say in that region. The other thing that we saw was people defining an ongoing and cyclical process, and we wanted to think about that and think about how you could frame a process that would be ongoing. A range of alternatives and prioritizing knowledge sharing. Okay, so here it is in all its glory. Our process put forth in one diagram. So the way that we even visualize this is that you have a four-step planning process that, as we say, revolves around the national cohesive strategy vision and goals, okay? And so the first step in that process becomes drafting a CWPP. We then imagine that spilling over into choosing regulations and incentives within the local jurisdiction from the community to the building scales. That the third step becomes implementing, maintaining, and enforcing regulations and incentives. And then the fourth step is responding to substantial change or a passage of time. We'll talk about what those might be, which then leads you back to that first step in the process. Now, we envision all of this as being supported by education, and that's why it is something that surrounds the process in the model. So now we're going to dig into each of these a little bit here, but this is the basic idea of a cyclical model that we thought tried to envision all of those processes and all those principles that we just talked about. We recognize that it's a conceptual framework and that there are many times that people are going to do great things that do not fit within this exact flow as we have it visualized here. But we're trying to help people think about how they can create an ongoing planning process that integrates jurisdictions and also allows people to work and implement within their individual worlds. Okay, so the core around which the planning process revolves. Now, for those in the fire world, you are probably familiar with the National Cohesive Strategy, which was a 5-year planning process between federal, state, and local officials that evolved out of the 2009 Flame Act. Now, there are 3 sort of high-level goals that the Cohesive Strategy established, and if you haven't seen the document, then you can go and find, if you just Google National Cohesive Strategy, you will come to it. And these high-level goals really have three, the cohesive strategy establishes three high-level goals. So the first is to restore and maintain landscapes, sort of landscape scale issues. The second is fire-adapted communities. This is actually kind of an important one, right? And the framework change here is to say that we are going to build, we recognize that we're building into wildfire-prone areas, especially in the West, and this may also be true in some places in the South. But in these fast-growth areas, we are definitely going to be building out into these WUI wildfire-prone areas. And instead of thinking just about fire suppression, we're going to be thinking about adapting the way we build our communities to fire, okay? And that change is really kind of huge because it's saying not just that we're going to try to suppress fire, but that we are also going to try to think about ways that when we are building the communities, we are adapting to the fire conditions that we know are already there and that with climate change will also increase. And then, of course, the wildfire response, which seeks to create an interjurisdictional framework. All right, so because the cohesive strategy really is sort of the framework that people agreed to, it seems that and also kind of guides funding, that sort of seems to naturally mean that any local region that is thinking about its wildfire purposes or issues should be thinking about how it's relating to the cohesive strategy. Now, step one then, as you begin this framework, we see as beginning with the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. Now, in many places, and this is not going to be true of all places, but in many places, the CWPP has been viewed primarily as a compliance document under HEFRA. And I will note that Idaho is one of those. And so Idaho, for instance, did initially CWPPs at the county level, and they're primarily a list of equipment or fire suppression requests that local counties would wish if there were money. But we are arguing, and we think that, in fact, the CWPP process offers a chance to do something far more, which is a chance to think not just jurisdictionally, say at a county level, but interjurisdictionally, right? It seems to us that that was the original intent, and some of you on this call, I'm sure, are in places that have already been doing this. But what we are proposing is that the CWPP process really offers a chance to think ecologically across jurisdictions and permits these local communities, especially in places in the West, where the fire danger often comes from federal lands or from state lands, to talk with those people about how they would choose to have those lands managed. They may not get everything they want, but they can engage with a conversation and think on the ecological scale at which fire works for them to create a plan that they couldn't if they were just planning within their jurisdiction. Now, another interesting thing that's starting to happen in some states, and this is actually happening here in Idaho, is that CWPPs are increasingly being integrated into all hazard mitigation, that should say plans. So all hazard, the countywide, so the CWPPs are being integrated into the all hazard mitigation plans. And what that does is it allows you to think more broadly about the CWPP, not just existing within the world of HEFRA, but also all the other issues that are associated with FEMA funds and disaster planning. All right, so CWPPs in many states are owned by the local fire community with very little participation by the planning or building staff, much less local officials. And moreover, there's no sort of nesting of plans. And if you go to sort of resilience theory, one of the things that people talk about is that it's important to have plans at different scales because plans at different scales can do different things. So what we are going to propose instead is that the CWPP should be readable, right? It shouldn't just be a document about for fire folks. It should be something that the planning staff, the building staff, the local officials, and the local community can actually engage and read and be relevant to other plans that they are actually implementing. It should be integrated from the federal, state, and local level, but it should also be integrated across departments, fire, planning, and building departments with local officials. And moreover, it should be updated. If it's integrated into the all hazard mitigation plan, that's going to have to happen every 4 years. I mean, every 5 years, sorry. Now, who needs to participate in the CWPP? We really suggest, I'm focusing a lot on the CWPP because this is not done that much anywhere, what we're kind of talking about. There are some great groups, and what we're actually kind of modeling here is something that happened in Boulder County, which is that you would get together the fire groups, right? That's sort of the traditional people that have owned it. The local official group, get some people that are actually officials from the different agencies, a local staff group, different departments, not just fire, but planning, building, maybe even public works, and then a citizen advisors group. And we know that a lot of fire communities fire departments have struggled to get citizens involved in the CWPP process. And so one of the things that we've seen people do that seems really effective is to go out and try to find leaders of the community to commit to the CWPP process and to come. And that doesn't have to be people that know anything about fire. It could be clergy. It could be people at universities or things of that sort, or just people who have some participation in a larger group. All right. When you actually engage the CWPP process, the key thing that you do there, right, is you identify and map fire risks, and then you talk about what mitigations they should be. In Idaho, we are moving towards asking, with Idaho Department of Lands, moving towards asking people to do this along watershed planning at the HUC 12 level. But you can see on the left there in Boulder County, Colorado, where they have used other ways of thinking about smaller plans. This also is from Boulder County using that nesting concept where you have one broader plan, but then other plans within that plan that work at a different scale and also have different things that they're providing. All right, so we've kind of talked through most of those issues as we kind of imagine them. And that then leads to, once you move out of that interjurisdiction, so one of the great things that the CWPP does, right, is it permits you to talk across those regions, right? You can talk federal, state, local governments, county can talk to city, but eventually to implement, you've got to come back into your own jurisdiction, and you've got to do something there. So we suggest that that's really where step 2 begins. And from there, we take it to the level, we focus primarily upon local governments and how they think about some certain threshold questions and then offer tools. And it seems to us that this approach can work independent of whether your community primarily imagines itself as one that is accepting of regulation, or one that is not accepting of regulation, where you might have to use other tools such as incentives or disclosure. So we suggest, from talking to the communities that seem to be at the forefront, that there's sort of 4 threshold questions that local communities have to ask. The first is, will that local community permit new development in the WUI? Okay, and for some people, that's just going to be, that is going to be the make or break question. And some places are just going to decide we aren't going to have any development in the WUI. And that's great. But since the Mountain West and the West are such fast growth communities, there are going to be many other, if not most communities, that are going to at least permit some development in the WUI. So if you decide that you're going to permit development in the WUI, then you have to ask whether you're willing to enforce regulations, right? And if you are not willing to enforce the regulations, there's no reason to adopt them, right? There's nothing worse than adopting a great set of WUI wildfire regulations and not enforcing them. So if you are not willing to do regulations, then the question becomes, what are the incentives or voluntary programs that the community would offer or might stand in place of those regulations? Now, they may not be as good in terms of preventing things, but if your community isn't willing to accept the regulatory structure, then you have to think of something else that might work. And then independently, the final thing about that is there what are the community values that your community has that would tell you what is the mix of regulations and incentives that would work? When we talk to people, excuse me, when we talk to people, they told us 4 really interesting things that helped them as they moved forward in trying to actually implement different tools. First, they told us to seek co-benefits. Strikingly, many people said that when they talked about wildfire, they actually often talked about other things that people cared about, like open space or recreation, in addition to wildfire. So even though wildfire may be important, that's how sort of these other places like the building department or the planning department can help a fire department achieve its goals, because these other co-benefits may be found in the areas that those communities think about, that those departments think about, that can really help with fire. People also told us that you really often have a short window, often about 6 months, to really implement something after a wildfire when people are thinking about it. People, as kind of already mentioned, to choose an approach that the community will support. The community support is important. And to anticipate and plan for after effects, such as flood, landslide, and all those other issues that we talked about at the very beginning. Now, for those places that are adverse to regulation, there can be really simple solutions, right? And this, of course, is a firewise-based approach, with 30 feet of dispensable face, metal roofs, and in Idaho, you have a lot of people using a weed abatement ordinance. But the structure that we encourage local communities to think about when they've asked those sort of preliminary questions and they get down to the question of how are we going to write code or what incentives are we going to offer, is to think about it through a community, neighborhood, site, or subdivision, and a building scale. Now, we didn't invent this. There's a lot of people that have already been talking about this. So I'm not going to focus too much on this. NFPA has a great guide with some different regulatory tools. Comprehensive plans can be great places. In some places like California, the general plan is the Constitution of Land Use and can actually provide a legal mandate for wildfire protection. California has a bunch of other interesting things with subdivision level provisions. The neighborhood scale tools, I'm just going to click through these quickly because I imagine that folks have probably seen some of this stuff. But if you haven't, you can come back and you can look at the different regulatory tools that are already out there. So we give a number of examples of those regulatory tools that have been implemented across the country. But I wanted to just talk about some of the non-regulatory tools because for many of these places, these are going to be maybe almost as important or more important as people are thinking about trying to incentivize wildfire protection where people maybe are adverse to traditional regulation. So one that's really popular, of course, is Firewise, and Firewise is a great program. But one of the things that I do want to stress, and we lay out sort of the 5 different things that a community has to do to be a Firewise community, is that Firewise is a good educational program, but you do not have a certainty of results. And this is, I think, really incumbent upon the fire departments to help their sister departments in planning and building to really understand this, because I sat on the Planning Commission here in Boise, and I can tell you that a number of developers will come forth and say that they are building a fire-wise community. But what they often mean is that they're creating a vegetation plan, an initial vegetation plan that is fire-wise compliant, which is great. But the other question then becomes is, what about the maintenance of that vegetation plan? And what are the types of activities that would be ongoing with that community? In other words, is there going to be a fire board as a fire-wise community requires? And so most of them, what they're really offering is fire-wise vegetation at the beginning, but they're not offering any sort of ongoing compliance or maintenance. Now, in Idaho, I can tell you, I always get the question about insurance. Why can't insurance solve this problem? Well, there's a lot of work going on this right now, but primarily the reason insurance cannot solve the problem is because most of the costs of wildfire are actually inured to the federal and state agencies, primarily the federal agencies, that are fighting those wildfires. And so the cost to insure the home only arises as to the destruction that occurs. And there's a great study by Headwaters Economics on this that just came out. And so you have this real division of costs and versus what's actually insured. So that's certainly one issue. But that issue of why can't insurance solve this is a major one that people keep coming back to. And I think it's important to help people understand where the costs are. The insurance industry has told members of our team that really insurance, that fire is a very small portion of insurance claims, and as a result, it's unlikely that insurance will ever, as long as the federal government is paying the primary suppression costs, the insurance is not going to incorporate that into the cost of insuring the property. Something else that's going on a different approach, and I'm going to talk here for about another 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'll take some questions. So, is in Boulder County. And Boulder County has done some really interesting work there, where they're actually offering a incentive program where if you meet certain parameters for mitigation, you get essentially a coupon, which permits you to receive a rebate for those mitigation costs, and also several insurance companies will accept that as a reason to reduce your rates, but often it's, frankly, a relatively nominal amount. Now, for those that are unable to, thinking about other tools, really HOA, CC&R seems to be the way people are going. And then, of course, this is a broader trend throughout the West and throughout the rest of the country. About 60% of new home construction is in HOAs. So when we think about how you could potentially regulate without having broad-based community regulation is to simply require as a condition of approval in the planning process that the HOA CC&Rs address wildfire. So that's something, again, where the fire department working with the planning or building departments can do something far more than any of these departments could do alone by requiring HOA CC&Rs that address wildfire. You could have a private contract that becomes binding on those individuals that does not require regulatory approval. Now, we talk about some other ideas in the book, in the guide, and you can go and take a look at that. But I wanted to now turn to step 3, which is that implementation, maintenance, and enforcement part. And frankly, this is one of the hardest parts about wildfire, because and the reason why is that wildfire is, as many of you know, is something that arises often because of vegetation, that the risk arises because of vegetation that's unkempt or things of that sort. And so it requires ongoing issues. And the planning process and the building permit process are primarily concerned about conditioning development as a one-time issue at the very beginning of development. So let's talk about some tools that local governments can use to think about ongoing enforcement and mitigation. One of the things we start with is simply this idea of improving communication. So many local governments already have some kind of a pre-application process where you bring together all of the departments, right? But I would encourage you to think about how meaningful the discussion of wildfire is in those pre-application processes. Is it meaningful? And if it is, I would actually love to hear about it. Are people responding when people talk about particular wildfire risks? And moreover, are they thinking not just about siting decisions, but are they thinking about how they're going to address ongoing mitigation efforts? Another issue that often arises is the meaningfulness of comments between departments on proposals for specific projects. What's unusual about the United States is that we create these planning documents like comp plans, but ultimately how they become implemented is on a project-by-project, private, individual basis, right? So how meaningful is the commentary that we are receiving from the various different departments in terms of whether that particular project is going to be good for wildfire, well protected from wildfire. And then finally, on this point, we just sort of encourage you to think about how you engage or think about the process of integrating across departments, right? The Rockefeller Foundation suggested having a chief resilience officer, someone who would be there in charge of and think about across different organizations, right? To sort of get all these departments thinking about these resilience type issues, and wildfire being how we adapt to wildfire being one of those. But the reporting structure, how do you think about how you all are going to talk about this? Now, in the book, we also talk about other enforcement mechanisms. We talked about how a lot of places are doing HOA CC&Rs already, but we cite in the book a really interesting third-party beneficiary provision for local governments, which would essentially allow a local government to step in and enforce HOA covenants related to wildfire, and then send the HOA a bill. Now, you may not want to do that in a lot of places, but if there's really high wildfire risk, that's something that places should be thinking about, right? And those third-party beneficiary agreements are often used in public works areas, but why not here? Development agreements. A lot of places in the West now require some kind of site-specific development agreement. California and Arizona really pioneered this in the 50s, and even here in Idaho, when you do a rezone, you almost always will have to do some type of a site-specific development agreement. Why not include wildfire in that? A number of places have included maintenance requirements in zoning, which of course permits you to use your abatement authority and zoning enforcement authority. Sisters Oregon redefined their nuisance ordinance to make failure to care for wildfire provisions a nuisance that could be abated through nuisance abatement. Nez Perce County, Idaho has done a really interesting thing where when you get a building permit, they don't tell you that you can't build in a particular place, but what they do is they give you a map that shows you the wildfire risk. And if it's blazing red or orange or something, that would give you pause, they are there to also counsel you about things that you can do to mitigate those wildfire risks. And Kootenai County, Idaho has pioneered a program where the city will actually do work for private owners on their property, mitigation work, but then they have to sign a maintenance agreement saying that that the private party will maintain that mitigated area for, I believe it's a 10-year period. So all of that's in the guide. But I just want you to see that there are really creative things that people are doing to think about this issue of enforcement that we think is pretty interesting stuff. So how does this process all begin again? Well, for most people that we talked about, it seemed that wildfire planning often begins with a wildfire event. And that is one of those things that can just start that process going again. Another thing is the passage of time. And we suggest that all planning processes have this built into them, that and if you integrate your CWPP into your all hazard mitigation plan, then that's going to be a statutory requirement of every 5 years. Now, you could also tie it to a local comprehensive plan, in California, the general plans, or other things of that sort. So that's the basic 4-plan approach. Now, we are doing work here in Idaho. I want to just give a little plug for a program that's helped us out a lot, which is the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program, which Molly Mowry at Wildfire Planning International has been doing. And they've done projects all across the West and have some grant funding available. It's become sort of a great place for people to reach out and talk to each other about different stuff. I was lucky enough to attend their conference in Denver in the fall, and I could say that there's really some people doing some forward-looking work along the lines of what we talked about today and even more. And I would encourage you to think about the CPAW program, and that's just a little plug for the good work that Molly's doing, but also I think is really a great group of people doing excellent work. So what are we going to do? Our grant goes on for 2 more years, outreach and engagement. We're looking to start doing local CWPPs in Idaho. Idaho has not done these before, and we know that there are other places like Utah and Colorado that have. We're trying to implement them. We know there are lots of other places in the U.S. that have not. So we're trying to take this approach, work here in Idaho, as is our mandate. But we're also trying to do things like this, which is to reach out, see if this model makes sense to other people, and to the extent it does or doesn't, we would love to hear from people. I would note that we currently are planning to host a wildfire planning symposium here in Boise in the fall of 2018. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, please stay tuned and stay in contact with me. And these are just a couple of disclosures that I've been asked to make. And that's really it. So that's the basis of the 4-step approach that we're offering. Again, I will openly acknowledge that none of this is entirely brand new stuff, but what we would suggest is new is the idea and the approach, this sort of 4-step approach of bringing it all together, thinking interjurisdictionally first, and then bringing it within your own jurisdiction, implementing regulations and incentives from the community down to the building scale, thinking about novel ways of implementing and enforcing that, and then thinking about what cyclical things would bring you back to going through that whole cycle again. So Stacy, I think that's all I have, and with that I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
All right, thank you so much for that, Professor Miller. You then let Professor Miller answer. So the first one is, how does the city get away from the violation of the donation clause in working on private land? And please don't say it's not building a railroad.
Get away from the violation of the donation clause and working on private land. With regard to, so the great thing about the CWPP process is that it is intended to bring together people from federal, state, and local governments. It does not. It is deemed an advisory document, so it does not give local governments control outside of their jurisdiction, and it explicitly also states, this is an important thing that has actually been litigated in California, which is that the CWPP it has an express provision that says that CWPPs do not have to comply with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. However, anything that is acted upon, so if the federal government takes any action on those public lands that would actually, like, say, cut down a tree or engage in mitigation, that is subject to NEPA. So if I wasn't clear about that, local governments are always still bound by their jurisdiction unless they're given extraterritorial authority. Like in California, there's a sphere of influence in that gives some authority outside of local jurisdiction. And Idaho has the same thing called Area of City Impact Agreements. But that's all negotiated with the county kind of by contract or by agreement. So absent something like that, cities are bound by their jurisdictional limits, and anything that's actually done on the federal land must comply with NEPA.
Okay, great answer. Feel free to follow up in the chat box if there's any other things to clarify. We'll move on to the next one for now, though, and that is, how important are word choices in plans like the CWPPs? For example, should we worry about updating words like let burn to a more PC term like wildland fire use or resource benefit fires?
Well, that's a great question. And we've been having this debate here amongst our team. And we have not decided upon specific terms yet, but I will tell you what we have decided upon is readability. And the thing that so for instance, with both of those terms, both of them sound very fire community to me. And one of the things obviously let it burn is not very, is more colloquial, but what we're encouraging people to do is to think about terms that both are clear, but that the community could actually take ownership of. So I don't know if that doesn't give a bright line, but that's how we're trying to think about it, which is what are the types of terms that are both meaningful to the fire community, but also to the non-fire governments officials, and moreover, are something that your average folks at an HOA, say, who are not doing fire every day of their life, what would be meaningful for them? So that's what we're trying to think of. We would love advice from anybody. We've found some great examples already that I'd be happy to share, but some of them are in the guide. But that's where we're aiming for as we go through.
Okay, and it looks like we might be clarifying for that first question, but for now we'll go to 3. Do you have suggestions for WUI areas where the social needs clash with the ecological? For example, in areas of Southern California, field treatments may help protect a home, but are often damaging to the environment. Thoughts?
Yeah, these are the hard choices, right? And I think, I guess what this is, I think, where we have kind of talked about this idea of starting with the CWPP process, because you could perhaps have those kinds of value discussions in your community before you get into other regulatory areas that might make it harder to have those types of conversations. So for instance, if you are having that, you could perhaps have that conversation more freely in the CWPP context, I would argue, than say in California when you get into a general plan context or another similar planning context, which A, would be jurisdictionally bound, but in addition would has other rules that go along with it. So I don't have a great answer for you. What I can tell you is that there's some great examples from a recent, and I keep referencing them, but I think they've done some great work, a Headwaters Economics publication that looked at 5 different communities across the West that did precisely the kinds of stuff that you're referencing there. And they did it kind of starting with this CWPP process, talking to the community about what their values are, and trying to find solutions that both had environmental and wildfire benefits. So that would be I believe Flagstaff is a community that I think has done this type of, dealt with these types of issues really well, and that guide that Headwaters did provide some other examples that are written down on paper.
Great. And so circling back around, just for clarification, so many states in the West have this anti-donation clause, which bind agencies and municipalities from doing work on private land with public money without repayment for the work that was done. So I guess the first question was actually in reference to that, and I guess any other thoughts about how they might get away from, I guess how they might work around that? Do you have anything you run into that might work, or is that kind of a local question that is really going to depend on that specific area?
I don't have a definite answer right now, so I would be happy to follow up with that person later. It's an interesting question.
So it looks like your email is right there on the PowerPoint slide. So if he wants to follow up with you, maybe you can have some offline chat about that. And that sounds like that's great for that. So we are perfectly out of time here. Thank you so much for a great presentation. So any of the resources that are here, I will send in the follow-up email, and most of them will also be posted online. Thank you so much, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.